Hello, my name is Becky Colsey. This is my Biology 213 lab report poster on June 2nd, 2021. It is titled The Effects of Wi-Fi on Germination and Growth of Two Unknown Seed Samples. For my experiment, I exposed two plant samples to three different levels of Wi-Fi exposure from a 2.4 gigahertz repeater. Although my experimental data only partially supported my hypothesis that Wi-Fi exposure would affect the growth and germination of these plants, my results do point to some interesting avenues for further study. Plants have the ability to convert the solar energy of the sun into chemical energy that supports all life. This energy travels in waves and is characterized by its frequency and wavelength. We have learned that plants have mechanisms to sense and respond to this light energy in the visible spectrum. But what about lower frequencies? In my experiment, I investigated the effect of the radiation from an in-home Wi-Fi repeater operating at 2.4 gigahertz. How does Wi-Fi radiation, typical of households, affect plant germination and growth? My hypothesis was that lower frequency energy will lead to inhibition of germination and inhibition of growth. The first step in my experiment was to determine what my two unknown plant samples were, using DNA extraction, PCR, and then outside sequencing along with the DNA subway routine. The next step was to plant my seeds and expose three groups of two seeds to Wi-Fi radiation, low Wi-Fi and no Wi-Fi, and monitor their germination and growth. Here I show graphs charting the height from days of planting and also the final dry biomass of both the mung bean and corn. The germination of the mung bean plants was only 25%, but I believe this was due to experimental error in sowing the seeds too deeply, and no conclusion can be made on the germination effects of Wi-Fi. The germination of the corn seeds was more successful at 94%. My hypothesis that the germination would be inhibited is not really supported by this data. As shown in the data here, the height and biomass did seem to be somewhat affected by the Wi-Fi exposure in the mung bean plants, but it was not as clear in the corn plants. The exposed Group A corn plants did grow more quickly until about day 29, and then their rate of growth slowed. The exposed Group A mung bean plant also grew at a higher rate after sprouting and then leveled off and slowed in their rate of growth. They also began to bend away from the Wi-Fi repeater signal at day 23. These observations led me to a new hypothesis that the Wi-Fi exposure may stimulate the hormone auxin. This would explain the bending of the bean plant and would explain the initially faster growth of both plants when the shoot tip was close to the signal. But as the shoot tip grew away from the strongest signal, the growth slowed. My hypothesis was only partially supported by my experimental data. I think that further studies should evaluate internal hormonal effects as well as mechanisms of action with larger experimental groups of seeds and plants and a constant signal source.